Hello there, this is Frank Burke with Dynasoar Rocketry, and I was asked to present a quick demo of how to assemble a very simple radio control rocket glider, including the radio install. So what I'm going to use here is one of my Aurora Clipper kits. This is a 1.7 or 1.6 inch BT60 diameter body tube based model. It's got about a 23-inch wingspan and is around 33 inches long and weighs around 8.5 ounces, ready to fly with a 24mm motor mount, and around 6.5 ounces ready to fly with an 18mm motor mount. These are designed to fly using long burn E6 rocket motors, either reloadable or single use, or in the case of the 18mm it would use the D2.3, which are also available. I use a 18mm motor casing with a plugged forward end because there's no delay and it just prevents any burn through. So I'll go through what I've got here in front of me and a couple of tools that you'll need, and then I'll start with the assembly. So first things that are going to come in the kit is you've got a wing. It comes folded. You'll need to unwrap everything. So the wing is taped together. It's already got a bevel cut for the dihedral, and the elevons are already pre-hinged for you. There's holes in there for the control horns when you glue those, and the carbon spars are already glued and taped in place. Got a vertical stabilizer. That's a single piece of 6mm Depron. You've got 3 small strips. These are used for centering the motor in the tube when you glue it in. You've got a motor tube. You've got 2 push rods with control horns that are already installed in place. You've got some spare foam, which is used for testing paint to make sure that the paint you use doesn't melt the foam. I personally only recommend either Testors or Model Master small rattle can, or Krylon shortcuts, which are small rattle can paints. Those don't impact the styrene. If you've got an airbrush and you've got acrylics, those that are water-based, those are probably safe as well. You've got a nose cone. You've got some Velcro that I don't have right here in front of me. You've got 2 rail buttons with T-nuts. And you've got a short body tube and a long body tube with a slot cut in it. And you've got a small coupler. Now the things you're going to need for the radio is you need a radio, of course. This is an 8-channel that I've got sitting over here. This is a DX8 from Spectrum. You don't need something quite that fancy, but generally something with 6 channels will have elevon or delta wing mixing, which is what you need to run the elevons. And then this also has flight modes, which allows you to hit a switch and select between 2 flight modes. Now the advantage of that is the flight modes allow different roll and pitch trim, and so I can set a little down or up trim for boost to make sure it goes perfectly straight. You'll need to adjust that exactly to your model, and then by flipping a switch as the motor burns out, the model becomes nose heavy because you're burning propellant in the back end. So as that burns, it gets nose heavy, and you need to trim that out with the elevons with a little bit of up. And so I put that on a second flight mode so I can independently trim the up elevator that I need for glide. And again, that takes a couple of flights to fine tune exactly. And it also allows, if there's a little bit of difference in roll in boost or glide, you can set those independently as well. So I've got my transmitter. I've got a small 1-cell lithium polymer battery. I'm going to set these aside for now. I've got 2 small, like 8 to 11 gram servos. These are high-tech 5055 Metal Gear servos. They weigh 9.3 grams and they center really well, which is important for the boost trim, because you don't want the boost trim to be wacky every time. You'd like it to be consistent. And I've got 2 8-inch servo extensions already connected. I'll need those so that the wires will reach all the way up to the end of the body tube to connect to the receiver, and the battery are all stored in the nose for balance. And the kit comes with this little adapter wire that has a red JST plug on it. That red JST plugs directly into the lithium polymer battery, and the other end has a servo receiver connector which will plug directly into the receiver. I'm going to go do that now in the battery port. And again, that part comes with the kit, and then you've got a receiver. This is an AR410 by Spectrum. You need at least a 4-channel small lightweight receiver. This one weighs 9.3 grams with the casing on it. You can pop the casing on it and save about 3 grams if you need to, if you're coming out too nose heavy. Okay, and then for assembly I'm going to need an X-Acto knife, a little bit of masking tape, a screwdriver to put the rail buttons on, a foam safe super glue. These are designed to be assembled only with foam safe super glue. I prefer Bob Smith Super Gold Plus. It's a little bit thicker, but again, it's foam safe. If you use regular CA on the foam, it'll melt it. And I've got an accelerator which helps set the CA glue. I've got a sanding block with some 320 grit sanding paper just in case I need to fine tune anything. Generally you only need that really for sanding these little tabs on the motor mount to get it to fit precisely into the body tube. And I've got a straight edge for any cutting or measuring that I need to do. So the first thing I'm going to do before assembly is I'm going to bevel the edges of the foam here. So it's not necessary to do that. I think it looks a lot nicer and it flies a little bit better. You can use the sanding block, but you have to use a really, really light touch so that you don't tear or catch the edge of the foam. What I found works better is just cutting a little bevel with a straight edge. So I'm just going to cut quick bevels, maybe about a 1/16 or a little bit more wide on the straight edges. These are the trailing edges of the vertical stab. And then for the leading edge, I'm just going to freehand that because I've done this a lot. And again, I'm cutting about the same amount of material that I did. I may use the straight edge for a little bit of the straight part. And again, the nice thing about these kits are nothing is super critical. You know, this is just for looks and a little bit of aerodynamics. You don't need to measure or do anything like that with it. The dihedral in the kit, you can be a little bit over, a little bit under. It's not going to impact things drastically. So I'm just dragging my finger along the edge and cutting about a 1/16 or a little more of the foam off the fin. And that gives it a nice little rounded edge, and you could touch that up with the sanding block if you wanted to. I'm going to do the same thing on the wing. So I'm going to bevel the trailing edge. For some reason I keep letting the ruler slip a little bit. So I'll do the top and the bottom. The control surfaces. Flip it over. Again, I'm just dragging the X-Acto about a 45-degree angle against the straight edge as a guide. There's the trailing edges. Again, for the leading edges on the rounded parts, I'm just going to do this by hand. There's a wingtip. There's a little bit of a tip. the other tip. Got a wingtip, and then I'll flip it over and do the other side same way. And again, this is just for looks and a little bit of aerodynamics. You don't need to try to sand any kind of airfoil into this wing. Okay, so I've got the tips done. Now I'll come in back with my straight edge and finish the straight parts with that. And this is really the only prep work on the foam that you need to do. For this particular kit, everything is white. Most of my kits are, and the color scheme, which I've worked with Sticker Shock to have a couple of different color schemes. One is TWA and the other one is Pan Am. There's also one for Virgin Orbit that I work with him. Those are available for purchase separately. They're nice cut vinyl decal sets that just stick directly to the foam, and then I don't even paint the models to save weight. The paint adds a little more than half an ounce, and you know, the foam is waterproof. The only thing you may want to put is a little clear tape on the bottom of the body tube on the bottom side, just so if you land in some wet grass, the body tube isn't going to get wet. But there's no real need to paint these, and it's just adding weight. Okay, so I've prepped the wing and the vertical stab. So the next thing I'm going to do is glue the little tabs onto the motor mount. Now the motor mount is pre-marked for you. I do these with a little marking guide, but nothing is perfect, so you kind of want to look at it. I also look at the edges of the little foam strips here. You don't want to sand too much off, but I do make sure at least one edge is more or less perpendicular. And I'll just go ahead, so I'm going to put a little bit of CA on that edge, and then I'm going to spray a little accelerator onto the motor tube. And I'll line this up with the line on there, make sure it's centered, and I'm just going to hold that in place for a second. Nice thing with the CA is assembly is very, very quick. Okay, so I'll take the other one and I'll put that on the opposite side. Now on this one I'm going to look a little bit and make sure it's lining up so that they're lined up with the other one. The line was just a little bit off on this particular one. So I'm going to hold that, so now you've got one on each side. This little piece of foam was a little bit long for some reason, so I'll just trim that off. And then I'll put the third one on. I don't need the accelerator on this particular one since it's already got some remaining on the tube. So I'll make sure that's lined up with the line, and I'll look at it from the end and make sure it looks kind of like that. And what's going to happen is once this is installed, the vertical stab has a tab on it, and that's going to make the fourth tab, and that's going to center the motor in the middle of the body tube. Okay, so those are all installed. Now all I'm going to do is just put a little fillet of CA glue. This, you don't need epoxy on this model, it's just tail weight. You don't need it for strength. The motors that this uses burn very gently. There's no high thrust peaks, and I'll hit it with the accelerator, and that's all good and ready to go. Grab a paper towel here. So yeah, all you need to do is make sure the motor doesn't slide forward under thrust, and the super glue is plenty good for that. Alright, so the next thing I'm going to do, I'm going to take the rail buttons and I'm going to disassemble them. These are 3-piece rail buttons, so you've got a collar, 2 washers, a screw, and the flange T-nut. So all I'm going to do is, the holes are pre-punched here. I'm going to reach in. I'm going to do this now because once you get the coupler in, your fingers aren't long enough to reach in there. So I've got the T-nut in. I'm holding it in place with my finger. I'll put a washer, a collar, and put one of the collars on the screw, and then I'm just going to screw it all together. And if you did decide you were going to paint it for some reason, you can always mask off the rail button. So I don't do too tight so that it kind of deforms the tube. Just tight enough so it's not going to come loose. And then I'm going to put the other one on the front. And assemble this. Okay, so I've got the rail buttons installed on that part. Now I'm going to put the coupler in. The coupler goes on the end that doesn't have the slot. So I'm just test fitting to make sure it goes in there. Put a little bit. Again, you don't need a huge amount of glue here. This just is holding the 2 tubes together, and you're going to glue them to the wing. So I'm going to insert this until it stops on the little flange on the T-nut, and that sets as far in as it should go. I'm going to set a little super glue with my spray, and that's done. And then I'm going to look at the second tube, and on there, I'm not sure if you can see, but there's a little line with an arrow. There's a line on this tube with an arrow, and I've drawn those so that the wing alignment line is going to be straight when you get it all together. So I'm going to put a little more super glue on the end of the short tube that has the little arrow, and slide this on the coupler and go back and forth a little bit to spread it, and then I'm just going to make sure that arrow mark is still there and aligned. I'm going to reach in with a little super glue and give a little spritz on the inside and the outside, and that'll set itself there in a second. Some things out of the way. Alright, next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to glue the vertical stab in place. So I'm going to test fit this. These are cut by me. They should fit pretty snugly. If they're a little loose, you can always squeeze the tube as you glue it. You can just squeeze the tube as you glue to make sure it fits nicely. So that fits in there real nice. So I'm going to put a little bit of glue on the 2 root edges where they're going to butt up against the body tube, and I'll put a little bit just below where the body tube is going to line up on the fin tab. I'm going to slide that in. You can always kind of slide it back and forth, wiggle it until it goes all the way down. And then I'm going to look at that from the rear and make sure it looks more or less vertical with the body tube. You're going to set this later when you put the motor mount in before it dries, and that'll set the make sure that the fin is perpendicular, so you don't have to worry about that it's super critical right now. So I just got that fin in there, I've eyeballed it, and I'm just holding it for a few seconds while the CA sets. And again, you don't need a ton of glue here. This is just sort of tacking it in place and making sure that it's there. So vertical fin is there. Looks like that's setting up okay. So I'm going to take my CA and I'm going to put a little fillet on both sides. I'm going to spray. Now sometimes this CA doesn't set right away, so you want to keep an eye on it and make sure that it's really set. You can kind of touch it lightly with your finger, see if it's still sticky. Give it a few seconds to set here. Sometimes the glue is a little stubborn and it doesn't set immediately, especially when it's thicker, like in a little fillet here. And if you set that up, it could run down and drip on the floor, and then you'd never get it out of your carpet. Don't ask me how I know. Okay, so I'm going to check here. Just rubbing with my finger. Okay, it looks like that's set nicely. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into the end here and I'm going to let a little bit of glue run down on either side of that tab. And what that does is that kind of locks the vertical stab in place into the body tube. So I'm just taking my glue and squeezing a little bit on each side and then holding it vertically and letting the glue run down either side. And I'm looking in the back end, and once it looks like the glue is there in a nice fillet, I'll just hit it with the accelerator, and that'll lock it in place. And so you can see you've got the fin tab sticking through, and more or less vertical. Now I'm going to double check just so you can see how the motor mount works, that this all fits good. So I'm trying to fit that into the rear, and it's just the foam tabs are a little bit long, which is intentional. So I'm just going to sand a little bit, just a little at a time. You don't want to overdo it and get it too loose. If you get it too loose, you can always cut a little strip of the surplus foam that I include with the kit and glue it onto the edge of the tab and then resand it. So nothing's going to ruin it if you sand a little bit. So okay, so it's just a little bit snug. Sand just a little more, both sides. And again, nothing super critical. If you get the fin a little bit crooked or the motor tube a little rotated, nothing seems to really ruin the way these things fly. I've gotten in a hurry trying to do some prototypes, and man, if you could see just how bad they look, but how good they fly, you won't be worried. Okay, so that fits nice and snug. It's making good cut. You can hear that squeaking. That's the fin tab hitting the motor mount, so that's good. You want some contact on that. And we're going to pull the motor tube back, and we're going to set that later after we get the wing installed so that we can make sure the fin is perpendicular to the wing and then lock it in place with the motor mount. So I am going to set my tube on the table here, and what you're going to do is just take your wing. There's a mark here. The wing isn't even with the end of the tube. It's about 1.25 inches from the rear end, but there's a line down the middle of the tube, and that should align with the taped hinge line. And I'm just going to set it on there so you can kind of see how that works. And I've got the tail hanging off because of course it's sticking down, so I'm just going to run some CA on this joint. Again, you're not going to glue the joint and let it sit and then glue it onto the wing. You're just doing this all in one step. And I'm going to give it a squiggle of glue down the line in the middle there, and then I'm going to put a little squiggle of glue about 1/2 inch on either side of the the middle wing joint. 'Cause as this wing sits, it kind of contacts the tube on either side. So I got my glue there. I'm going to turn it over, set it on the wing, or on the body tube, so that the mark is even with the rear. The line here is lined up, so it's straight down the body tube. I'm going to look, now the way I'm holding this, the wing has a little flex, so the wingtips are actually touching the edge of the table, so I know they're about even, and I'm looking at the vertical stab, and I can see that the vertical stab looks to be pretty straight up and down. And I'm going to make sure this is being held, so I'm going to hit a little CA in the front and the back. And I'm just going to sit here and hold this in place for a few minutes. You can see when I'm not paying attention, this thing is slipping, so I need to hold it in place. So basically all you're doing is you're setting this in place till the glue sets. And once it's set, you can apply a little fillet. So now I'm going to look at my dihedral. I got about 2 inches. I'm just making sure it's about the same, and then I'm look at it from the back. Yeah, that tail's pretty perpendicular. You can check with a straight edge. This is pretty, has a pretty good close edge for checking if it's perpendicular, and I'll compare that. And that's pretty straight up and down, so that's pretty good. I'll just hold that a little bit longer and make sure that's set. My distance from the back end, there's a pencil mark still there. And then what I'm going to do to make sure this is really glued down is I'm going to take my super glue and I'm going to put a little bit of glue. I'm going to squeeze about every inch into the joint. And that super glue will spread itself and it'll fill in that whole joint. So you don't need to have a solid line of glue there. And see, now by the time that I've gotten done, that glue has spread all the way out into that glue joint, and I'm going to give a good spritz of accelerator in there. And I'm going to hold it horizontally, because these are the times when the glue doesn't set immediately, and you want to make sure you don't flip it over or hold it vertical until that glue is set. When the super glue is thick in a large fillet like that, it takes a little more time for that to set. So you may spritz it again, and the accelerator doesn't seem to affect the body tube. It's not like you're going to damage the body tube by spraying the accelerator on it. Okay, so that looks like that's setting pretty well. I'm going to still keep it more or less horizontal. And I'm going to do the same thing, so I'm squeezing little squeezes of glue about every inch or so. Turn it over, I'll kind of look, it looks like it's making good contact. Make sure that's in real good. You can actually set it up right, kind of push down onto the body tube, make sure it makes full contact with the wing foam. got the tip of the stabilizer there up against the edge of the table, and put a little mark on the foam, so I'll just sand that out. Okay, I can squeeze and I can see a little bit of glistening, which tells me the glue hasn't quite set yet, so I'll give that a couple more seconds. Okay, so just sliding in. Okay, so I've slid that in. Then I'm going to look at the back end of the model again. Set my wingtips up about the same 2 inches or so. Compare it with the end of that. Offset a little bit. Okay, so the vertical stab, pretty perpendicular with the wing. Okay, so I've got that aligned good enough, and I've got the motor recessed about 1/2 inch, and I'm just going to take my super glue and hold it vertically and run a little bit of glue down along both sides of the motor tube on each one of those foam tabs. Again, you don't use a ton of glue, and then I'm going to put a little bit of glue, run it down both sides of the vertical stabilizer where it hits the motor mount. And we'll let that run down there for a few seconds till it looks like it's more or less all the way. And that's enough to lock that in there, and then I will spritz it with the foam safe super glue, and that locks it in. So now the stabilizer is locked into the motor mount. Motor mount's not going anywhere. Wings are all attached. And last step I'm going to do for this is put in the push rods and control horns. So the control horns, the push rods are symmetric. So the way I set it up, the push rod is going to be on the inside of the control horn, and it'll angle it in slightly toward the body tube. There's a left and a right, the way they come in the kit. And the Z-bend on the front end is going to be pointing in toward the body tube, and that's how it's going to connect to the servo. So I'm going to take one of these control horns and put a little glue on the little prongs. There's holes that are already punched into the control surface to put them in the right place. So you just put some glue, stick that in, give it a little spritz. And on this particular model, these go on the top side of the control surface. The servos are mounted into the body tube, the wings on the bottom, so the push rods are on the top. And that keeps them up off the ground so they don't get grabbed by grass or anything. So I just put the other control horn in. I'll spritz that a little bit, give it a second, let that set. So you can see how the push rods are kind of angling in toward the body tube a little bit, and that's what you want, as the servos are going to be inset into the body tube. So the last two things here, I'm going to turn it over, and the horns stick through the foam a little bit. So I'm going to put a little bit of glue around each bit of the horn prong that's sticking through, and spray it with some accelerator. And what that does is that kind of locks that prong into place on the other side of the foam, so it really locks it in. I've never had these control horns pull out ever, so it's pretty robust. There's one last little thing I like to do. I like to put a little bit of CA on the inside of the body tube, lined up with the rail button. And what that does is the model, when it's sitting on the rail, this back end of this body tube sits on one of the clamps or a standoff. And if the wind's blowing, it can wiggle the model around a little bit because of these big wings, and that can kind of mush the end of the body tube just a little bit. So I put a little bit of CA in there and just hit it with accelerator, and that just toughens it up so that when it's sitting on the standoff, it's not going to kind of crunch the body tube. So now we'll proceed with radio install. So I've got my radio here. I'm set up with Elevon mixing, or Elevon wing mode, or Delta wing they sometimes call it. And I've got my receiver with a little adapter plug plugged in. I've got my battery, the radio's on, so I'm going to plug that in. And I plugged my servos in. And I'm going to hold the two servos in my hand. We'll see if you can see the arm movements. So when I pull back toward me or up elevator, the arms are going forward, which is what you want because that's going to pull the control surface up and make the model pitch up. When I go forward, the arms are going to go back away from me. When I go right, the right servo is going to go forward and the left one's going to go back, and vice versa. And that gets me the right directions that I want. When you go right aileron, you want the right elevon to come up. That's going to dump lift and make it roll to the right. And the other one's going to move the other way. So I verified that those are moving the right directions. If you don't get the right directions on your radio, you can try the servo reversing, or you can swap the plug-ins of the two channels for aileron and elevator. On this Spectrum AR410, it's channel 2 and 3 are the ones for aileron and elevator, so you can swap those inputs till you get them going the direction you want. A lot of times with these servos, the arm will be a long arm that sticks out on both ends, and so I'll turn the radio on, take the little arm that comes with it off, and put the new arm on. And I found that if you rotate the arm 180 degrees, usually one of those rotations lines up better with the gears, and the arm is more vertical, straight up and down. There's not an offset. So I'll figure out which way that is, and then I'll take my X-Acto knife and trim off the bottom of the arm on the servo. So I've made sure those are fitting right. Now one last thing I'm going to do, I'm going to take my X-Acto and I'm going to slice the top of the servo flange for mounting, because these are going to be glued in place. And I'll just fold that down and pop those off, and then those don't stick out in the way and they don't look as ugly. I've never had any problem. I glue the servos in place. I don't use double back tape. Double back tape can soften and come loose. I cut a pocket in the body tube. I make sure it fits snug, and then I glue it down onto the foam. I've never ever had a servo come loose. It's just the best way to do it. So I've cut those little flanges off, and now what I'm going to do is I'm going to hold the servo up against the body tube, make sure my elevon is more or less flat where it would be, and I'm going to slide this along until I see, okay, the Z-bend would line up with the hole in the control arm if it was sitting in about that position on the wing. So I'm going to take my pencil and I'm going to draw a line on the body tube, and that's going to be my guide for cutting out the servo pocket. And you can cut it a little bit bigger if you need to adjust it. I'm just taking my X-Acto in there and I'm going to slice down. Now the servo isn't going to be able to sit all the way in because the wing has a glue joint against it, so the pocket can only be so deep. Okay, so I'm just taking my X-Acto, I'm cutting on those pencil lines. So now this servo, again, the servo arm is sticking out. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to unplug that one from the receiver. I'm going to double check that once the servo is in there that the wire actually reaches out of the end of the body tube, so I can pull the nose cone off, get at the receiver, and get the battery. So what you do is you just plug the battery in to turn it on and unplug it to turn it off. There's no switch. It's just another thing to go wrong. It's extra weight you don't need. So I'm feeding this down, the wire down through the body tube. I'm going to slide the servo in. And because I've done this a few times, it fits pretty good. And it goes in a little ways. It doesn't go in, all the way because again the wing is glued to the body tube. So I'm going to take the end of the push rod and connect it to the servo. And again, make sure the wire is all the way down. And I'm going to push that in there. So you can see the servo's in its little pocket, inset about as far as it can go. The push rod is lined up pretty well with the control surface, and I've got the control surface more or less flat. So that's what you want. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to plug the servo back into channel 2. The reason you want this on is to make sure that you haven't bumped the servo arm against the gears. So that looks good. Looks like the pocket that I've cut, you can rotate this servo just a little bit. You can wiggle it a little bit and you can see the surface go up and down. So you can do a little fine tuning with the zero just by exactly where you put the servo. Okay, so I'm going to put a little super glue on the bottom of the servo. Again, you don't need a whole lot. There's not much force on these guys. And then I'm going to slide this into the pocket as far as I can go. I'm going to lift up the wing. And I'm going to look at it from the side, and that's pretty flat, pretty well aligned. I'm just going to take a little bit of my super glue, put that on both sides. You don't want to get it in the gears or anywhere near the servo arm, but it's okay to glue it up against the body tube and around the wing. So that's in there. Just going to give it a little spritz. That doesn't do any harm to the servo. And then I'll double check that back is up, forward is down, right. We'll make this one go down, so that'll make more lift and make this one come up, and that'll roll it to the right, and left does the opposite. So that's moving in the right direction. Alright, so far so good. So now we're just going to do the other side. So we're going to make sure the servo is down all the way. Sometimes you can put a little tape on it, keep you from forgetting. Sometimes I'll forget to do that and you'll cut your pocket. It's in the wrong place. So, wow, looky there. That's pretty flat too. So every once in a while a miracle happens and you do something right. And that looks pretty good. So I'm going to pop the servo out a little bit, turn it upside down. You don't need a ton of glue. Again, this is it's super glue, so it just makes contact. It just glues into the surface, right? It's not soaking into anything. So just make sure there's enough on the bottom. Make sure it looks like the control surface is pretty flat. Put a little glue on top of the tube and in front of the servo. Again, you don't want to dribble it on the servo arm to get into the gears. Spritz that with a little super glue. Put my glue away, my tape, and I'll double check. Okay, so back is up, forward is down, right, the right one goes up, left one goes down, left one up, right one goes down, and then for glide I've got it set on a switch, and they pop up maybe 3/16 of an inch, and that's all in the instructions, the exact amount you need. Now this is pretty good looking from the back. If you needed any fine tuning of the controls, you can simply go into the settings. There's a mode called servo setup. The first thing that pops up is travel, and then the next one is sub trim. So you can go up to the sub trim into right aileron RAL and left aileron LAL, and you can adjust those numbers separately, and that'll fine-tune your controls so that they're perfectly aligned. And that's what you do before flight. So you want to make sure that the control surfaces, with a ruler, are level with the wing when they're at neutral. And you can look at the throws. This is about, I've got maybe 5/8 of an inch of elevon movement. I use more for elevon because when the motor's burned out and it's nose heavy, you need more throw because the model's nose heavy. For roll, I'm using a little bit less, maybe a 1/2 inch or so. You could probably get by with 1/4 of an inch or so. I like a lot of control throw movement. You don't need a lot, but I just like to set them up that way. So that's that's literally the radio install. The next thing would be balancing, so I'm going to get my Velcro out, put a little Velcro on the receiver, and I've already put some Velcro in the nose cone. So one set up for the receiver, one is set up for the battery, so both the receiver and the battery in this case will go inside the nose cone, and I've got a little tape on there to friction fit it so that it doesn't fall off. So make sure everything's moving good here. I'm going to go grab my pen real quick. And for this particular model, the balance point is 10.5 inches ahead of the trailing edge of the wing. So I'm going to make a little mark. I'm using a little fine line Sharpie. These are great for making panel lines on the models. Go over to the other side. And that was about 2¼ inches out. Come to the other side, about the same place. And mark it 10.5 inches. And these are my balance marks. So when I go to balance the model, I can just put these on it and I can double check in the field. Okay, I've got my CG marks. Alright, so here I have my makeshift balancing set up. So I just got 2 bench vices. I've got chopsticks in them. And on the point ends of the chopstick, I've just taken some spare pieces of Depron foam and just pushed them into the end, and that just protects the foam from getting dense when you set the model on that. So I've got my balance markings there, so I'm going to set those in place, and I've got the loaded motor in the back the battery in the front just like it would be, and the model is balancing just a little bit nose down. This angle may be a little bit hard to see, but it's balancing just a little bit nose down, which is perfect. If it was balancing tail heavy, you could put a little bit of the lead weight that comes with the kit in it. In this particular one, I put about 5 of the little lead shot BBs in, squirted some super glue into the nose and hit it with the accelerator and gave it a second or two to give me just a little bit of nose weight that I needed. And that is really all there is to it. The model's ready to fly. All you have to do is put in a loaded motor, double check your control surface throws are going the way you want. You should do that before every flight. And get it out and give it some flying. We'll put it on the scale real quick here. See what it comes out at. Six and 3/4 ounces, which is around the spec, 6.5 to 6 3/4, and that's without paint. And for the 18mm motors, you want to make sure that you keep it super light. This is kind of on the edge of that motor for liftoff weight. If you were doing the 24mm model, it would come out around. It's got a heavier nose cone, and it should come out around 8.5 ounces ready to fly, which is pretty ideal for that. So you could use some fine line Sharpie and draw some panel lines or detail if you wanted onto the model. I do that quite a bit. If you're putting the vinyl decals on, you could apply those now. This particular nose cone is kind of a translucent plastic, so I scuffed that really good with 320 and then 400, and then sprayed it with a white paint and put the cockpit decal on already, but that would be the one thing that you would probably want to paint. And there you go. Very, very simple, very quick to do, and it's a nice flying rocket glider that would get you started. If you're comfortable flying a model that goes around 50 miles an hour with ailerons, then you'd have no problem